Okay, so let's begin by talking about your work with Civitas Malawi.
You're welcome.
Can you talk a little bit about how it started, what were the influences, and where the work is now?
Yeah, actually, the work that we're calling Civitas Malawi now began around 2003 as democracy clubs in two schools in Zomba, a girls' school called St. Mary's and a boys' school called Zomba Catholic. It came as, a sort of, an interest from my perspective as a social studies educator, just coming out of Malawi in 1994, the things that we've discussed about in the past, that between 1964 and 1993, Malawi had actually been in a culture of dictatorship. And then before that, 1964, before that, all the way to 1858, it was under the colonial powers. So Malawi was largely a nation that was heavily suppressed in terms of its freedoms, in terms of what people could, articulate publicly or so. So you could not really tell what they were thinking about. So the post one-party dictator rule in 1994, when it became a multi-party democracy, somehow the euphoria of freedom was somehow misunderstood. Malawi being one of the poor states, because of the freedom, people started a culture of vandalism, breaking property, street lights in the long way, breaking scarce resources in schools. And we understood that here were people that were suppressed, and suddenly they want to vent out on anything. So as educators, we felt there was a space to do something. And so I and my colleague, who sadly passed on, Alois, we asked the college to allow us to engage two secondary schools close to us. So we used to go there twice a week to engage students in what they felt democracy was and what their role was in that context. So because they had not been talked to like that before, so we were engaging them. How do you embrace democracy? What does it mean to you? Does it mean breaking property and stuff like that? We didn't bring answers, but we just wanted to engage. We were calling that democracy clubs.
Wow. So it started just in two schools.
Two schools.
And right after the 1994 switch to a democratic model.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, so when I was doing my master's program with Virginia and Polytechnic State University of USA in Blacksburg,
right.
It was done here, but the professors were coming to us. There was the American professor, Josiah Troll, who heard that we were doing that, and he was interested. So he asked us to do a report of what we were doing, and we did that. And he kind of believed us, but he also did not believe that we could have done all that work from our own intuition as educators, as teachers, without any sound or heavy resource. Because we used to walk there, we used to ride dangerous cars, or even just walk there and do these things. And even the teachers in secondary schools were surprised why the university lecturers were coming to their school to do things like that. Yeah. But we had an interest to understand what the young people were thinking about democracy and their future. So he sent our report to the Center for Civic Education, which that time we didn't know about. Sure. And then we were invited by the Center for Civic Education as part of the Sub-Saharan Africa Educators Delegation. Two of us from Malawi, and in other countries, Mali, Senegal, who were in California. And then we spoke about our program, and I think out of that, the Center for Civic Education became interested to support us more formally with what now became Civitas Malawi, getting after the Center for Civic Education programs worldwide. Right. So, that's the background, that's where we came in, and that's how it started.
I see. Very good. So are there specific influences that you could point to, maybe from your master's degree or so from your individual reading, that has continued to kind of lead you along as this journey has developed? Yeah,
I think part of it is my own story. Because the one-party dictatorship that I'm talking about, I was part of that. We were, sarcastically called born frees because we were born after 1964. So, the politicians called us the born free. We were not in the colonial era. But that was not the freedom that democracy entails. They meant we were not under colonial powers. But most of our rights were denied. For example, you could not talk anything bad about the previous government. And we saw most people, or we heard that most people that had tried to do that had been arrested, had disappeared without any explanation, and the government was not questioned. And so even as young people, we learned not to question adults, even if they were wrong. So when an opportunity arose, for example, when I was in first year in college, my first year university education, there was this national debate that do we need to be in one-party dictatorship or do we need to go multi-party? Without fully knowing why, but I think we need to change and allow multiple voices in the multi-party era. So I was one of the people that was there to vote in 1993, and we voted the dictatorship out. So from that, we wanted, then after the 1994, the violence and then the vandalism somehow shook us that I think this is not what we wanted in a democracy.
Yeah.
Maybe we were wrong, maybe they were right. And then that was the motive to engage the young people to look at how are they understanding this? How do they want to grasp the future where they are contributing more positively and not negatively like it was happening. So it was more from that perspective, and as a social studies educator, the issues of governance, the issues of democracy come often in my classroom. So we wanted to transfer it to the young people in the schools and begin to hear their own perspective. So it was more to do with that kind of an interest that arose from that. So, and personally, I grew up, not having seen our own constitution until I was in the university. And even then, the whole class, the whole university did not even have access to the constitution. So we really grew up without knowing our rights, and we wanted things to change. And we wanted a different life for the young people that were growing after 1994. And to some extent, I think that has happened. And then another influence, I talked about my professors from USA, Virginia. I think the way they approached the lessons was different from my British kind of education, which I got through primary, secondary, and University of Malawi, where it was more examination oriented. But at the master's program, we were more allowed to critically think and engage with our whatever we were reading. Did it make sense? Did we agree with the author? Did we have our own opinion? So suddenly we realized that I think it's good to have an opinion. It's good to have a voice. And so we wanted to take that to the schools to see what the students were also thinking about the new Malawi and then their role in that context. So it was trying to bring a different kind of feeling amongst the students. That in a way was also a part of the American education system that I think influenced that kind of approach.
That's interesting. So in a way, that's your personal story, but there's also, in a way, it sounds like what you describe as the crisis of freedom, of what happens then, and of course the burden or the responsibility that should come with freedom. And it's interesting to think about the role that education can play, and the path that you took, which is that we've got to get into the schools. But it's a nice segue, because I've heard you say in various meetings that the project for you is about a new Malawi. And so what I think you mean by that is a future for Malawi in which citizens continually need to take ownership of. They need to own that future. So can you say more about that idea?
Yeah, actually for me the new Malawi means also a lot of bring back the issue of self-belief. For many Malawians, that having gone through the issue of colonization, and then later on through one-party dictatorship, suppression, dictatorship, there was a lot of doubt about their abilities, about whether they really would contribute positively in their life. And so you could see a lot of people that were moving around more or less lifeless. So for us, it was, a need, for me in particular, it was a need to see something different, to allow Malawians through this engaging process to believe in themselves, to believe in self-actualization. We were trained to wait on somebody, maybe the colonial governments to do things for us, or maybe the dictatorial government to do things for us. But we wanted a different breed of Malawians, the Malawians that would actually solve things for themselves. Yes, with support of others, but believe in themselves. But also, I've said in many places that there was a lot of a culture of shame, because you mistreated, a lot of your rights are trampled on, so you are less of a human being. So we want to bring back this feeling that no, you are not less of a human being like anybody else. You are actually, this is your country, this is Malawi. You have the right to be here, and then you need to be heard. You need to contribute, both socially, economically, politically. You have a role. And so this is part of the new Malawi that I'm talking about. The politicians talk of the new Malawi in the sense that we've moved out of colonization. But, as I said in other forums, most of the most of our politicians, have come from that background. They talk democracy, but it's more theoretical than practical. When you look at their inner beliefs, you truly realize that they are not there for the people. They are there for themselves. And we want Malawians that are mindful of the opportunities that they have, but also the responsibility that they can have to others that are less fortunate than themselves. So this is the new Malawi that I'm talking about, a Malawi where you realize you have a role to play, and you can contribute, and you need to be heard, and you need to contribute.
Yeah. So, but your work specifically is about the role of education in a democracy, and it does strike me that, with a constitution, the new constitution written in 1994, that this is even more pressing. And certainly in my experience here in Malawi, when you bring up the issue of civic education or democratic education, there's a real passion, there's a real drive that teachers, educators want to talk about these issues, and they see them. But talk a little bit about the education role in this project for a new Malawi.
And I'll add to that, it should be the role of education and the role of educators to the democratization process in Malawi, and maybe in Africa. I have to tell you that one of the challenges we still have in Malawi is that we have high illiteracy levels across the country, and particularly amongst females, I have to say. Malawi is 52% female, but in terms of higher education, less than 30% go as far as higher education. And so you find that, I sorry to say that, most of the bad political decisions have to do with people not being able to access government documents, not being able to read, not being able to understand public policies. So because they cannot access, because they cannot read, they cannot demand that which they don't know. So usually those, bigger politicians, they easily exploit. For example, when we're going towards elections, like in 2014 we'll be going for general elections in Malawi, you find that they will bring little things like maybe a packet of sugar, which is a need. It's a survival thing for a Malawian, maybe a t-shirt for someone who has no shirt. So once every 5 years somebody can get, a t-shirt or something and vote for a wrong guy because they didn't have time to analyze who they are, what they stand for. And so year in, year out, Malawians get a raw deal. So education there becomes a tool of empowerment. If they were to be educated, if their literacy levels are elevated, one way or the other, formal or informal, then they will begin to analyze the policies. Then they will begin to demand certain rights that are taken for granted. So education there becomes key, becomes pivotal. Educators becomes the bridge. We become the people that reach them without trying to exploit them. We try to go there like on the same footing, and then giving them another dimension that there is more to what you're receiving than you're getting from. So educators become the bridge between the government and maybe the people, because we are there in the classroom. We read documents, we read policy documents, and we can talk in their language. It doesn't have to be in English or whatever, but we can talk their language, and we can begin to share what they need to do in order to participate in this democracy. And that's critical because politicians don't want that. They don't want the people to know. But we are there to enlighten the people, to empower them with knowledge, skills, values that should contribute positively to this nation. We too want our people to develop. When we go in the villages sometimes and people lack basic resources, we are not happy. So we realize that if we don't do something, the status quo will remain. And so education and educators, we are sort of the hope of this nation. So I have to say, that's how I view my role. And in the program that we do, for example, we take the people as young as 6 years, for example, 6 to 11 years in primary school, through the foundation of democracy, which we have translated into local language. They begin to interact with the constitution at that level. As I've said, I never saw a constitution till university, and we're changing the tables. They're getting that constitution way back in primary school. The same with the students we deal with in secondary school. So they know what belongs to them, and they have to know. They question things, even they question their teachers. We never question our teachers. We were beaten by our teachers. Sometimes even when we're not wrong, we never question that. But so we ask them to question things. They question why is very important
Yeah.
to individuals. Yeah. So that's what I can say about the role of education and educators in the Democracy Project for this country.
Yeah. It sounds to me like what you have is a clear democratic curriculum goal, regardless of whether it's explicitly a civics curriculum or not, that this is part of what we mean by education. Do you find some resistance? I mean, I know yesterday we spent some time at the Damasi College of Education, and these were what we would call social studies teachers in the United States, but they were training to teach geography, history, theology and religious studies, and various other social sciences. Yeah. Do you find some resistance that they say, "Oh, wait, I'm here to teach history. It's not about citizenship or democracy. What are you talking about?"
Plenty resistance. Plenty. Especially because in our context, we're trying to bring life to civic education. I'll tell you that there's civic education in our curriculum. After the 1994, there was curriculum review, whereby issues of democracy, human rights, good governance have been brought in the textbook for social studies. So it's there in the textbook. However, it's taught like a dead concept. Memorize it, write an essay, pass an exam. We are bringing civic education as a practicum, something that you live daily. If you see somebody's rights being trampled on, what do you do? That's not in the textbook. If you see your rights being denied, what do you do?
Yeah.
If you see problems in your community, what do you do? What's your contribution? What's your role? If there's a public policy document lying in the library, is it helping Malawians? So we are bringing the practical touch to civic education, and we've met and we still meet a lot of resistance. To begin with, even the schools, the school authorities. In some cases, we've had wonderful cases in schools, but the authorities have said no more civic education, no more Civitas Malawi in our school. Suddenly, the authority is challenged, so they're scared. They are losing grip on what has always been the tradition of power dynamics. So there's a resistance at school level in some schools. There's resistance at policy level in the ministry. We've brought different ministry officials to our programs, but somehow you can still feel some subtle force, some underlying force that says this. After what are you trying to bring? It's already there in the textbook.
Yeah.
But we're saying there must be knowledge outside the textbook, outside the classroom, whereby this is some element of internalized, intrinsic value to civic education.
Yeah.
So and I would add that so there's that sometimes the head teachers, sometimes the ministry officials, sometimes the communities, when kids go to interview, some people say, no, you cannot interview me. The usual thing about I cannot listen from you. Why not your head teacher? Things like that. So, but slowly we are breaking the barriers.
Yeah.
And things are working.
Yeah. But really trying to get at the lived practice, the experience of, as you say, values, democratic values, commitments to a larger civil society. So one of the things that struck me was the student team that did a Project Citizen project and presentation on mobility and transport issues, and they had found that there was some difficulty in crossing the river,
especially rainy season.
In the rainy season
for the young ones. Yeah.
So they came up with a set of solutions and suggestions for the community leaders to fix the road, build a bridge, all the formal types of things. But what struck me is, in addition to that, they went out, gathered some wood, and built a makeshift bridge so that the children could make it to school. Yeah. That's a lived type of citizenship. It's not abstract. It is practical. Into practice. Yeah. It might even be, I know you're familiar with Paulo Freire, he talks about praxis.
Yes.
Right? Is we have to think theoretically.
Pedagogy of the oppressed.
Absolutely, right? But we have to put theory to work. And it seems to me that is really key to kind of your approach as you move forward here.
Yeah, and I have to say, for example, the issue of the bridge you bring about is real in many parts of Malawi.
Yeah, of course.
With young people, especially rainy season, which is November all the way to March, April. The whole night it rains and tomorrow they are unable to access education. And so the kids in the school saw that as a problem. The community saw that, but the colonial and then post-colonial mentality, it will be done by somebody for us. The waiting syndrome. The students are seeing a problem and they say, we can do something about it. So that's the kind of the practical part that we want to change. And suddenly the students we work with are bringing that perspective. The democracy in the textbook in the community, which is a good balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk specifically about the post-colonial context. You know, I think I've mentioned this to you. It seems to me that the history of British colonization is everywhere in Malawi. Not just education, it seems to be just pervasive. But in my interactions with folks in Malawi, it rarely comes up. People don't tend to talk, at least to me, about the colonial period, and then of course the dictatorship period after that, is it's just not talked about. So I wonder if we could talk specifically about, you've mentioned a few things, right? Your sense of that history and how it plays out in contemporary terms. You've talked about a culture of shame. You've talked about a culture of silence. And then you've talked about issues of self-belief. And then what you just called the waiting syndrome is, well, we have to wait for someone to fix that problem.
I have to tell you that the demographic dynamics of the population of Malawi is such that over 65% are youth. And by definition of youth, we were in another meeting last day, it's 35 below. So we got independent in 1964. So you see that most youth have no real bearing with the colonial history. And so most people you talk about, you know, do not necessarily have the exact interaction with the colonial history. And most of those that did not have formal education. These are our parents, the generation. So you are likely not to, you know, to interact with most of them. And then, you know, you are likely to see that history coming up if you're interacting with an educator, because we have no choice but to confront that history in our context. So that's the challenge that we have, that unless it's brought up in academic lecture theater rooms and so on, people are not likely to, you know, to talk about it. But it comes to Malawians in silent ways, because the parents that lived through the colonial era, grandparents or whatever, they're still there. And they still treat young people as they were treated by the colonial powers. So one way or the other, silently, it still goes to how people relate to life, how they see life, how they see themselves in the, you know, community, what they can do, what they cannot do. And so in a way, this colonial issue is there.
Yes.
It's there in our education system. It's there in the way we look at life. Everything is pretty much British, the way we drive, most of the things. But I am glad to say that there's a lot of curriculum shift. I participate in all curriculum development processes at secondary, at primary level, and sometimes at tertiary, especially from the teacher's perspective. And we are bringing in what we call critical thinking skills, you know, whereby you don't just have to accept what is taught to you. You've got to interact, you've got to question, you've got to have your own opinion. And so we bring in that learner-centered kind of learning all the way from the primary going upwards. And so suddenly I think we are building a generation that begins to ask questions, that begins to discover things for themselves, cooperative learning and things like that. So we're not there yet, but I think there's a paradigm shift in the way people are thinking. And I think, you know, sooner or later, we'll begin to see changes in the way people perceive life, in the way they see their role in the socio-economic context of this country. So we are getting there, and we're patient enough to know that it has to, you know, colonization took over 100 years.
Of course.
So the colonization process has to take longer sometimes. So, but we are getting there. As teachers, we are doing all we can to make sure that process takes place, and it's happening.
So would it be fair to say that part of the project of the New Malawi is a curriculum shift?
It has to be. Curriculum shift. And emphasis on examination has to shift, and it is shifting. Of course, we are currently, you know, operating on outcome-based education. I've looked through literature. It has got its own shortfalls. It's not worked in other areas like Canada or whatever. But that's what we're working with now. And then in there, we're talking a lot about, you know, assessment reforms, whereby you don't just assess learners from examinations, but you also assess them from what they show throughout the you know, classroom work, teamwork along the day, you know, all these other intelligences that are there, multiple intelligence sort of. So we're bringing in all that kind of looking at a learner, not just from the lens of an exam. We're looking at a learner from multiple perspectives, because human beings have got different ways of showing their capabilities, and trying to capture that. It's difficult, but I think as educators, it's our role to deal with the challenge and see how best that can, you know, roll out in the way people turn up.
Yeah.
But I have to also mention that I for one, I refuse, for example, to believe that because of our history in the colonial power, then it determines what I can become. I have said it's a question of mindset. It's a choice. You know, you cannot choose, for example, your parents or whatever, or you cannot alter your history. The fact that we were under Britain or whatever, we cannot alter that history.
Right.
But we can do something about the future. We can completely change the future. And I always tell the teachers we train, the learners we train, that let's not dwell on the past. Let's not be stuck in the colonial history. Let's look ahead and see what is it that we can do to change our history, to change our legacy, and so change Malawi to the kind of Malawi we want. So I sometimes refuse to believe that we can be stuck with blaming colonization. I normally say, let's do it. We were in that process, we were there, but let's move on. Let's change.
Yeah.
Change is real.
Yeah.
That's my belief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, some would argue that you have to look backward, right? You have to historicize before you can effectively move forward. But I take the point.
Yeah.
I take the point. And then it's something I've been meaning to ask you, which is that some would say, particularly in more recent critical circles, that the project now has to be a de-colonial one, right? The De-Colonial Project. So the idea being that it's not just pointing to the colonial legacy, understanding the colonial legacy, while of course that has to happen, but we have to actively work to undo the damage done by the colonial project. What do you think of this idea?
I agree with it to some degree, because yes, the colonial legacy still is with us in many ways, in terms of the kinds of political leaders we have, are still there in many ways. And so we still have the overtones of what used to happen. So we must guard against that in many ways. And I've also said that people still have yet to learn to question wrong things. People still see wrong things happening and they're quiet. In that sense, the decolonialization process has to happen, where people need to believe that I'm okay if I am different. I'm okay if I can say something different to my boss, to my principal. People sit in meetings, and even at where I work, the college, this is true. People sit in meetings, and then as long as the bigger person is there, they're quiet because they are afraid of saying something wrong. So they're afraid of voicing their opinions. In that context, we need to decolonize the minds to allow people to be free with their thoughts, their conscience, say exactly what they want to say it, and then not be apologetic about their opinions. Because who knows, we could benefit. You usually talk about the power of ideas. If you hide your idea, the whole nation could suffer because maybe they need that idea. So in that context, yes. But part of the project has to be empowering people.
Yeah.
And empowerment is multiple. It could be empowerment in the context of education. Nelson Mandela has always said education is the key. It is only through education that a child, a daughter, a son of a peasant farmer in the rural Malawi can one day rise to become the president of the land. Only through education. A child or a daughter of a miner in South Africa, somebody who is mining, can one day rise to become the president of the bank. Education, nothing else. So you go around Malawi, you see how many kids are out of school because they cannot afford to eat in the morning, to have proper dressing. Survival for the family is more important than being in the school. Something there bothers me because education is so powerful. My own story is such that if it were not for education, the story would be very different. So it's about decolonization on one hand, but critically speaking, this is 2012, it's empowerment, education empowerment, and income generating activities. People are so poor that they wake up and they don't even know what maybe they're gonna eat, where they're gonna sleep, or things like. So when you see that, you realize we need to empower our people to begin to believe that they have a role to play. Even if they may not have been in a formal classroom, we can gather villagers and ask them about their opinion, because they have a role, they have a voice, and we need to tap on that voice. So in my view, we need to think about both projects because they are as equally important. And education is top on the agenda.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it strikes me though that the education system is a British one, and that exam is driving everything that happens in terms of education here. And there are those, John Malinsky comes to mind, wrote a book called Learning to Divide the World, Education at Empire's End. And he argues that it is precisely the this style of education where the exam, and that, of course, the exam happens at multiple points, that ends up tracking, classifying, organizing people, right, through that one exam is part of the imperial project. And it's a powerful book and it's a powerful argument, but it strikes me that Malawi is still, in a way, kind of under that yoke of that exam. And we learned, you know, just the other day, the situation of young people who have done what we would hope they would do. They've persevered, they've succeeded in secondary school, made it through, but there aren't seats at the university, at the vocational school. And those are the, I mean, we're not talking about those that didn't make it through the doors of the school.
That went through the bottle.
Yeah.
And dead end.
And still the dead end.
Yeah. True. And we see it. The policymakers see it. But somehow they're still stuck with exams. It's that still part where the exam takes the center stage in education. And that's not education. Malawi, I will tell you, has educated people that currently are unemployed. And because they were not taught any other critical thinking skills, they are educated rejects. I used that word in one of our forums. And they are also disillusioned. They are also frustrated.
They have to be.
With the system. But we can deliver the education that, yes, talks about the possibility of a job, but also talks about other windows of opportunity.
Sure.
So that people are not stuck when they reach that end where, okay, I thought this, but I can as well do this. Education must really open many doors of opportunity. And unless we do something with this British inherited curriculum, which we're trying, unfortunately it still clings to exams.
Yeah.
We really, according to me, we really are in a difficult situation.
Yeah.
So our curriculum is too much of exams. We try to bring in certain things like assessment reforms, but I think we still have a long way to go. I have to accept. So maybe we'll learn from what's your system. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the United States seems to be, in my view, moving backwards, of going, undoing a lot of the good work that's happened and going more to a rigorous exam-based single measure, not only for students, but also now measuring teacher effectiveness. But that's a different interview, I think.
On another day.
Another day.
Yeah.
So, you know, I want to ask you this one question, because we've been talking about it in and out for the last 3 or 4 days. You know, I'm interested in the idea of spaces and places, but particularly the idea of civic spaces, or maybe even critical civic spaces, and what that might mean. And of course, we've talked a little bit about the legacy of the British here, and the way in which the cities were laid out, developed, or one could argue not developed. And what you don't see in Malawi are courtyards, kind of other types of colonial spaces where you would see much more of an interactive public civic culture. You just don't see that. Not even in the capital, Lilongwe. You don't see it here in Zomba. Now, one of the things you pointed out is that people will find their own spaces, and I think you're exactly right, for dialogue and civic engagement. In other words, they'll find it where they can, they'll create it where they can. You mentioned the minibus as a possible site where some real democratic work is happening on the road from Lilongwe to Zomba. But how do you think spaces, or the lack thereof, of political engagement might impact the democratic future, or the new Malawi, as you call it?
No, I'll be very honest with you, until you brought that up, I didn't notice that we didn't have the civic space. This is me. Until you said it, and I have a background of urban geography and town planning. And I've seen those public squares, and, for me, I thought it was a way of, beauty of towns.
Yeah.
And until you mentioned, I said, he's right. But, I'll tell you, Malawi loves its social avenues. You were just saying that yesterday there was a wedding here. Not many weddings would come here because this is expensive.
Yeah.
There are so many, weddings in the villages,
Yeah.
around Zomba. People come as early as 8 o'clock to celebrate with the family, and then the wedding starts at 3. So they're seated, they talk.
Yeah, of course.
Guess what? Politics comes up.
Of course.
Issues of civics come up. And then funerals. Unlike maybe in the West or whatever, funerals here are a social gathering. Somebody dies, the whole village is there. And you sit there morning to sunset, and then what do? You talk. It's no longer a funeral. So you engage in the issues of democracy, issues of leadership. So somehow, some ways, we get to know the issues. And then those that are not educated enough get to learn from those amongst them during weddings or funerals and things like that. And the issue of minibuses, not many Malawians do drive.
Yeah.
So they are often in public buses, and then, the issues come up and so on and so forth. So it may not be a definite civic space in the context of, missing squares in town, which is critical, which has to happen. And when you brought it up, I intend to challenge my urban geography students to think about it and maybe research more about it. But somehow we've since 1964. I'll tell you, soon after independence in 1964, 6 months later, there was a cabinet crisis. Dr. Banda was nearly overthrown.
6 months.
1964, 6 months. Because somehow, after people have met, they still have other forums where they do meet and engage in that kind of discussion. So, to me, and all tertiary institutions, and maybe high school institutions, like where I went at Chancellor College, we have what we call the public quadrangle.
So the university
has been central to the democratic process of Malawi because of that opportunity for students to meet, to dialogue, to question things, and to protest. Even before there was multi-party democracy, we were able to go to the streets. It began with the trade union and the university. We even demonstrated against the Malawi army. I was 1992. Childish kind of thing, but BBC picked it up, and then the media picked it, and then there we were, presenting a force, and then the winds of change started to blow. So in all our public universities, tertiary institutions, those public squares for students are there. And that's where things are supposed to start. And then the other, grouping begins. So we've got, a little bit of informal spaces that are very active to bring out issues. And so Malawi do dialogue around issues that affect them.
I have to ask you to tell me again about the football pitch. And the role that played in 1994 and the events leading up to it. Yeah,
for example, lack of public squares. So, events leading to 1993 and then, 1994, we would just get out from the university because maybe the authority said no. So we just walk to the roads and then get to a school and then go to a football pitch. And then we say, whoever has something to say, go on the podium, talk to us. So we had lots of people that came up, on students, other leaders, and so on. So the changes began in our football pitches, which we call our freedom parks.
Freedom parks.
Freedom parks. They are not very formal, but in all these other cities, we've got freedom squares, freedom parks, where people used to gather and get something for change.
That's fantastic.
And change did come.
That's fantastic.
And we were a part of the change.
Yeah.
I was part of that change.
Very good.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. So I've been jumping around quite a bit. What do you think as we think about this new Malawi? What we're seeing, of course, is new forces, new players entering the mix. Let's not beat around the bush. The impact of the Chinese that are all over Africa, and they're certainly here in Malawi. It's not the same set of forces as the colonial period. Imperialism that we might historically think of, but one wonders: is it just the same again? Do we see meet the new boss, same as the old boss?
The challenge of being poor is that anybody with some money can call the shots, and it's not just for Malawi but for other African countries. So the issues of post-colonial, colonialist imperialists coming up because they can build your road, they can build that, then they somehow begin to interfere with your beliefs, with your culture and stuff. That is there.
Yeah.
And people sort of are unable to speak against, because, you know, on one hand they're destitute, they're hopeless, on the other hand they're not so happy. So there's that problem. But I have to say that part of the globalization impact is through media. Most of our young ones, you know, look to the West, and I would say maybe USA, for example, or Europe, you know, as a would-be place to be. And what they get is usually what is brought on TV. And not all of that is the real day-to-day life that is there. So in one way, they fast-track issues to that kind of thing and then bring it to themselves. And then without really, you know, understanding, you know, that that's not the day-to-day life. So, for example, you mentioned it in one of our forums that not everyone in the US is rich and things like that. And so people think that you don't have to respect your culture, you don't have to respect your identity and so on, and you just have to go up there. But I believe education must be so good to you that it must still make you respect your culture. I am, by Malawian standards, one of the few that are highly educated. I'm yet to do my PhD, but, you know, where I am now, one of the few, maybe one of the 2% of Malawians that are highly educated. But if I were to take you home, you'll be surprised. My father has not been through his A-levels. How I treat the people at my home, when I'm there, maybe there's a funeral or whatever, I'm one of them. Because I am supposed to remain a Malawian at heart. I have been to a couple of places, as you know, thanks to civic education and other programs. And often I've been asked by my friends, you had the opportunity to just remain there. Why did you come back? And this is how a common youth would look at that. I go to US, first thing I'll remain there, I'll sneak. But I'm different. If education has to make sense for me, I have to contribute to my country in whatever way, because I have to give back. This is where I've been. Yes, there may be things that I'm not happy with, but this is where I belong. I can go, participate, get educated, whatever, but eventually I have to come back and make a difference in my community, in my village, in my education, and this is true. I said this in Alaska, I said it everywhere. There will never be a situation where I'm in Europe, I'm in America, and I'm stuck there and I don't come to Malawi. Never. Because I belong here. And I relate to my culture, and I'm powerful at my culture, but I balance life. Because the world is one. Human beings. I've made great friends like you. Apart from the color, you're just like my other brothers, you know. And this is what we must make the young ones believe, that, you know, they are just as good where they are. They just have to improve themselves through education and then come back, improve their communities. So it's media and, you know, imperialism and so on. It's enormous. It's a big pressure for the young ones. And most of them do not have the skills, do not have the education. And so they don't really understand that which they see. And so it's unfortunate. And so, you know, slowly that's globalization for me. And I teach the course. And every student I touch understand that. And they realize he's right. And so I say, take the message to your schools. Take it to your corners. Let somebody believe that, no, you have to make a difference. It took people, it took patriots, it took Americans to build America. It has to take Malawians to build this country. And there is no shortcut. We just have to do it. Yeah.
I can't think of a better way to conclude. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.